I was shamed into visiting a penitentiary. That visit turned into a weekly habit, and now, after a year of these visits, I'm unsure if I prefer the company inside or outside the prison. I belong to a church, but I am not a particularly good person. If I were to compare myself against those people I know and care about, I would rank myself in the bottom third. That could mean either that I travel in good company or that my own virtue will never be rewarded with a trophy. Both things are probably true. Another true thing is that I wish I were far better than I am. I've always believed that good company might help me fulfill that wish, and assuming that it has, I hesitate to consider the person I would be without such good company. Over time, that bit of self-knowledge has kept me active in my church. Because of my upbringing, I define goodness using a Christian vocabulary. If Jesus suggested a certain quality, then that's a quality I'd like to emulate. My moral theology is no more sophisticated than that. So knowing this about me, you'll understand that prison visits are something I would have never sought out on my own. One day I was walking across the grounds of my church, and by chance my path intersected with my pastor. Since his pace was quick and determined, I looked for a way to be both brief and sociable. "Where are you headed?" I asked, suggesting interest when no such interest actually existed. "Prison," he remarked in a way that was clipped and implied no further elaboration. I might have imagined a dozen likely destinations, but honestly, prison wasn't one of them. However, when anyone makes such an unusual declaration, it suffices for any interest that might have been lacking. However, my initial surprise clearly expressed my disconnection from Christ's advice that visiting prisoners was the same thing as visiting Him. Really, I didn't need to say anything. The distance between me and visiting a prison or prisoners was vividly displayed across my face. "You know," my pastor said, "there are few specific actions that Christ asks of us. Maybe it's a box you need to check." I had no answer for his advice, and my need for words brought an end to our conversation as he turned and went on his way. Yet that moment bothered me, and it did so for most of a week. Finally, I used the occasion of our next meeting to ask, "How do I check that box?" That was some while ago. Since then, I've been making a trip every Saturday to the state penitentiary. It is a trip of about 20 miles that leads to an isolated parcel of desert real estate. It is connected to the rest of humanity by a poorly marked 2-lane road and the never-ending presence of air traffic to an international airport. That last detail is both inadvertent and cruel. Inmates sentenced to long terms of confinement are constantly reminded that other people travel to faraway destinations with no restrictions. Watching that never-ending flow of airplanes across the sky is like obliging people who are crippled to watch a never-ending track meet. When I arrive, I meet with about 8 other people, maybe 2 of whom are either priests or deacons, and a few of us are women. All of us are volunteers, and we divide ourselves up to visit groups of inmates housed in various cell blocks. So, what are these visits like? Well, The prison is a place dominated by concrete, gravel, and razor wire. Everything is clinically clean and geometrically exact. What's most memorable is not what's there, but what isn't there. It is an environment devoid of decoration, color, or scent. The sunlight is shadeless, and the wind is constant, each unbroken by anything green or growing. The prisoners all wear uniforms of light gray canvas, with large block letters making it clear that a convict wears them. Yet apart from these uniforms, the people wearing them appear no different from those you'd meet in any other context. Their presence would seem entirely appropriate if they were seated next to you at a McDonald's. Most are white, some are Hispanic, and given where I live, only a few are black. Your natural inclination is to feel quite comfortable around them. But a few distinctions do separate their company from the norm of experience. Imagine yourself in a group on the outside coming together for religious reasons, and that group is invited to discuss what is on their mind. In such groups, of which I've often been a part, one topic that often comes up is just how the rest of the world has lost its way, with the clear insinuation that since we're here in a religious setting, that doesn't include us. When prisoners meet for religious reasons, the tenor of conversation is never that. Typically, they lead with their own brokenness. Those they describe as having lost their way are always themselves. They never seek comparison with others, hoping to benefit from that comparison and then come out looking good. Here's an example. While at the prison, as a part of the gospel reflection, the person conducting the service asked if anyone knew of a life saved by love. A few moments passed before one of the younger inmates raised his hand. "Yes, I do," he said. "Two lives come to mind." "Please share," the leader offered. "Well, a few years ago," the inmate said, "I was holding a gun, aimed at the forehead of someone kneeling at my feet. Before I pulled the trigger, that person lowered their hands, looked me in the eyes, and said, 'I love you.' The inmate paused and said, 'That love saved their life, and mine too.' I offer that as a particularly memorable example, demonstrating the confessional candor that often flavors an inmate's approach to faith. Seldom in the outside world do we confess to each other about who we are when we are at our worst. Yet the transcendent love at the heart of every religion matters exactly because of what is worst in us. Another distinction that sets them apart is born of their unique circumstance, a circumstance that makes demands seldom experienced on the outside. Visiting the woman's portion of the prison, you occasionally pass a nursery reserved for inmates who are new mothers. Some nurse babies soon to be raised by foster or adoptive parents. Other female inmates use the time reserved for chapel to sit with their nursing friends and offer support. They all realize that this bonding time leads to a motherhood destined to be greatly deferred or even obliterated. I've wondered, do women unrelated to each other on the outside find it as easy to support nursing mothers? Maybe. I'm not a woman, but seeing how these women gather for each other in such an adverse situation, well, it's moving. In the midst of all this enforced alienation. You'll see them all in a group moving from one facility to another. Young women pushing the wheelchair of an elderly inmate, and all finding some random reason to laugh. I've talked with a Native American who came from a reservation several hundred miles away. Now she's closing in on a bachelor's degree and hopes to win release, go back home, and establish a nonprofit to assist indigenous children in foster care. Children like she once was, and her own children now are. Amidst all this is me, an outsider, invited to mix among them while never being a part of them. Not only am I an outsider in that way, but my colleagues are all volunteers there for purely altruistic reasons, motivated by their own kindness, while I'm there simply because I was ashamed not to be. I am an outsider among the outsiders, pretending at a virtue that isn't really mine. On my last visit, I was paired with an older man close to my own age, retired and well-meaning. He is gifted with a good heart, but as a practitioner of the pulpit, he is out of his depth. When it came time for his commentary on the gospel, it was like watching someone drown without any arms. He had set off in search of a point, mumbling aimlessly, trying to find a place he wasn't even sure existed. It was painful to watch,
well, the Bible,
made more unbearable because I thought I could do a much better job. I confided to myself, in miserable self-assurance, that everyone would be better served if this reflection were mine to offer. Eventually, I simply waited for a conclusion, and when that finally came, the rest of the service mattered less to me than the addendum to a surgical procedure. No sooner was the service over than I started collecting the books used by inmates to follow along. A young man saw the urgency with which I collected those books and interpreted that to mean I was late for another obligation. To be helpful, he immediately joined me in the chore of collecting these books and carrying them to a locker at the back of the chapel. His enthusiasm to assist was charming and completely unexpected. When I turned to receive the last of those books, he said, "Mister," as if apologizing in advance for the delay his own words might require. "Yes," I replied, with even measures of gratitude and the strong desire to be out of there. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "You have no idea what these services mean to me. They are the highlight of my week." In the time it took to say those few syllables, I slid from the narcissistic relief generated by my own egotism to the abject humiliation I truly deserved. I could only look at him sheepishly and say, "Thank you." It was an expression of gratitude for a compliment I truly did not deserve. Never has a thank you felt more counterfeit or self-serving. As I said at the beginning of the story, I've come to wonder if I prefer the company inside or outside our state penitentiary. What is no longer a source of confusion is why Jesus preached that by visiting prisoners, we are actually visiting Him. Nor am I unsure about whom He thought could be helped most by such a visit, the inmate or the visitor.